Mr. Bright left the room and went to get the nurse attending to Naomi. He asked for the uniform that Naomi was wearing earlier before they changed her clothes. The nurse gave the uniform to Mr. Bright, and he went outside and placed the uniform perfectly in the back of his seat. After staring at Naomi for a while, Sandra left the hospital room. She was already running late for work, so she left Mr. Bright in the hospital and headed home. Mr. Bright gave the nurse a tip and asked her to look after Naomi. Then he left the hospital and went towards his car. Something surprised Mr. Bright. He had 2 flat tires. He hadn't noticed this when he came to keep Naomi's uniform. He had only 1 spare tire, so he decided to walk down the road to get help. A few minutes later, Mr. Bright came back with someone who helped him change his tire. It was time for him to travel back to the city, where he had knocked Naomi down to look for her parents. As Mr. Bright approached the city, something strange happened. He turned to pick up the uniform which he had placed perfectly in the back of his car. But to his greatest bewilderment, the uniform wasn't there anymore. Mr. Bright stepped on his brakes immediately. He decided to pull over and search for the uniform. He parked his car and got out. He searched for the uniform, but it was nowhere to be found. He picked up his phone from inside the car and called his wife. When she picked up, he asked her if she was the one who took out the uniform he had placed in his car. His wife told him she never touched the uniform. Mr. Bright stood for a while wondering what was going on. First, his tires were deflated, and now all of a sudden, the uniform he had placed in the back of his car seat was no longer there. If his wife said she did not take out the uniform from the back seat, then who did? When Mr. Bright had called his wife, she was with her best friend in the office. Sandra's friend Deborah had come to visit Sandra at her workplace. She asked why her husband would be asking about a school uniform. "Have you adopted a child without letting me know? Me, your best friend?" Deborah asked. Sandra told Deborah the story of how her husband had knocked down a girl after he had gone to visit someone in another city. Deborah was touched by all Sandra had just told her. From Sandra's description, the little girl was about the age of Pascal, and she knew the incident would definitely make Sandra remember her dead son, Pascal. "I would really like to see this little girl," Deborah said with so much concern on her face. Sandra told her that they would be leaving in the next 30 minutes to go see the girl in the hospital and know if she had woken up. Back at Naomi's house, her father, Mr. Brick, who had just come back from the police station after reporting his missing daughter, met the door to his house open. He had warned his wife earlier to shut the doors, but he was surprised to find the door open. Mr. Bright opened the door slowly, and his wife was not in the sitting room. The whole place was so quiet. He bolted the door behind him and went further into his room, but his wife was not there. He went to Naomi's room and slowly opened the door. There he saw Sandra on the floor, just looking at Naomi's clothes that were on her little wall hanger. Then she took Naomi's teddy bear and held it tightly to herself, as streams of tears ran down her cheeks. Mr. Bright was so broken seeing the state his wife was in. He went towards her and consoled her tightly. Sandra never knew her husband was already back. She held the teddy bear tight, and the tears ran down her cheeks. He then lifted his wife from the floor where she was seated. He wiped Sandra's tears with his hands. "What did the police say? Will they find her? Did they find my Naomi?" Sandra asked. "I just reported the case, my dear. I know the police will do their best to find our baby," Mr. Brick answered, trying to give hope to his wife. What if Naomi didn't make it out of the operating room? What if that was the reason why the man who knocked her down didn't come to look for us? Sandra began to ask again as tears started all over to roll down her cheeks. "Don't be pessimistic, Sandy. We will find our daughter and she will be okay," Mr. Brick said, trying to be the carrier of hope for himself and his wife. "Go and freshen up. We will eat out and then we go to the hospital and wait for the man. Hopefully he may come back to the hospital," Mr. Brick said to his wife. A few minutes later, Sandra was done in the shower. She wore her clothes and then left the house with her husband. They arrived at an eatery to eat, but Sandra had no appetite. Any little girl that passed looked like Naomi in her eyes. Sandra didn't have the appetite to eat, so Mr. Bree packaged some of the food and took it with him. He left for the hospital with Sandra because they wanted to know if the man had stopped by. Back at the road, Mr. Bright kept wondering what was actually going on. He knew his wife too well, and she wasn't the type of woman to tell him lies. But he wondered who else would have taken the uniform. He had already made up his mind to look for Naomi's parents, and he wasn't going to stop halfway. He knew what both he and his wife had to go through when they lost their only son, Pascal. He needed to find the girl's parents, uniform or no uniform. "I'm going to look for the parents of that little girl. Who knows what they are going through?" Mr. Bright said and got back into his car. He started driving into the city and towards the direction of the accident scene. But the more he drove, the more confused he got. He couldn't actually identify the scene where the accident had taken place because he was in a haste. The first place he stopped and asked questions, it seemed like he was at the wrong place because there was no accident recorded there yesterday. Time was speeding by, and Mr. Bright needed to find the girl's parents. He thought about going to the police station, but then another thought came to his mind. He thought it right to go back to the hospital where he had taken Naomi to. He knew the hospital so well because it was by the roadside. Perhaps Naomi's parents may have come there in search of their daughter, so he went back into his car and drove towards the hospital. She picked up her car keys and left for the hospital with Deborah. Deborah asked Sandra who would have taken the uniform her husband had called her earlier about. Sandra said she had no idea because she never touched the uniform. It felt strange to Deborah, but she decided not to talk about it. When they both got to the hospital, Sandra took Deborah to the ward where Naomi was kept. Naomi was still lying motionless on the bed with a bandage on her head. "What a cute little girl. I wonder what her parents are going through," Deborah said with a mixed countenance. "All I want is for her to get better," Sandra said, holding Naomi's hand and trying to smile. She could feel the little girl's finger forming a grip on her hand. "I think she's finally awake," Sandra said, feeling so much happiness. Both she and Deborah focused on the little girl, waiting for her to open her eyes. Suddenly, the little girl's grip on Sandra loosened, and she started shaking like someone going through a seizure. Sandra got really scared. "Doctor, doctor!" Sandra called out, running out of the hospital room. A nurse came running towards her direction to know what the problem was. Sandra told the nurse that Naomi suddenly started shaking. The nurse asked another nurse to go and call the doctor while she ran in to see Naomi. Luckily, the doctor was around, and he came quickly to see the condition of Naomi. Deborah and Sandra were asked to step outside while he attended to Naomi. Sandra went outside immediately and called her husband on the phone. She told him that it seemed Naomi's problem was getting worse and that she was so scared of what was going to happen next. Mr. Bright had already arrived at the hospital. He got out of his car and was about to lock it up when a call came in on his phone. From the way his wife sounded, he felt as if the surgery was done with complications. He became so worried and couldn't bring himself to go into the hospital. He got back into his car. After a few minutes, Mr. Bright called his wife on the phone, asking if there was any news about the little girl. His wife told him that the doctor was still inside with Naomi and there was no news yet. She was almost in tears. Lots of questions started popping up in Mr. Bright's head. What if the surgery wasn't successful? What if the little girl dies? What will you tell her parents? What compensation do you think your money can give? Can your money replace their dead child? Do you think they will let you go scot-free? As the questions kept racing through Mr. Bright's head, he suddenly became scared. He knew finding the girl's parents was the right thing to do, but he couldn't bear looking them in the eyes and telling them that their child is dead if something went wrong. Mr. Bright reversed his car around and left the hospital. Whoever you guys are, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I promise to do my best to make sure your daughter gets well. I pray she gets well and I'll return her to you. I promise. Mr. Bright said out loud as he drove away. Mr. Brack and Sandra waited and waited at the hospital, but no one showed up. Mr. Brack left his wife and went outside the hospital. He called the police to see if there was any news yet, but the police had no news or lead about their daughter. Mr. Brick saw a Jeep fitting the description the doctor had given. The Jeep was black in colour with a bull bar. The car drove into the hospital's vicinity, a distance away from where he stood. The man in the Jeep got out, answered a call, and got back into his car. Mr. Brick stood for a while just observing the car. He wanted to go and ask questions, but he felt as if it was wrong. When he finally got the courage to ask questions, the car reversed and left the hospital quickly without entering the hospital. Mr. Brick heaved a heavy sigh. Then he went back inside to see his wife, whom he had left. She was lying down on the waiting seat inside the hospital. Mr. Bright tried touching his wife and realized she was having a high temperature. "Your temperature is high, Sandy," Mr. Brick said. Sandra sat up with her face looking pale. "Don't do this to yourself. Don't add to our problems, please," Mr. Brick said, holding his wife. Just then, the doctor walked towards where Mr. Brick and Sandra were seated. "Doctor!" Mr. Brick called, running towards the doctor. The doctor, who was actually coming towards their direction, stopped a bit as Mr. Brick ran up to him. "Doctor, my wife's temperature is high, and it seems like she has suddenly fallen sick," Mr. Brick said to the doctor. The doctor walked to where Sandra was seated, felt her temperature with his hands, and asked her how she was feeling. Sandra explained her condition to the doctor. "I assure you that your daughter is safe and well. The man who had taken your daughter seemed like a nice man, and all he wanted was for her to be okay. Don't be hard on yourself, okay?" the doctor said to Sandra in a consoling tone. "Can I see you privately?" the doctor said, looking at Mr. Brick. "Sure," Mr. Brick answered and followed the doctor. "Sir, your wife is going through the trauma of your missing child. I will advise you to call some of her siblings to be around her. If care is not taken, she may go after her life," the doctor said. Then he wrote down a list of some drugs Mr. Brick had to buy from the pharmacy. He handed the piece of paper to him and was about to walk out. "Excuse me, doctor. Please, can I ask you a question?" Mr. Brick said, calling back the attention of the doctor. "Yes, go ahead," the doctor responded after turning back. "The man that brought my daughter to this hospital, is he tall, dark, with a white beard?" "Yes, I think that's exactly his description. That is the description of the man who had brought your daughter here. He came with a black Jeep having a bull bar." "How did you know?" the doctor asked inquisitively. Mr. Bright took a step backward and folded his lips, trying to hold back the tears that were building up. "Doctor, the man just left this hospital a few minutes ago. He drove in and I saw him, but I didn't have the courage to go and confront him," Mr. Brick said with so much regret. The doctor heaved a heavy sigh. He assured Mr. Brick that the man would definitely come again looking for them. He told Mr. Brick not to tell his wife about it for her own sake, and then he walked away. Mr. Brick stood confused for a while. He didn't know whom he was going to call to stay with his wife. His wife's sister stayed in Ghana with her husband. Mr. Brick walked slowly to where his wife was, lifted her up and walked with her to the pharmacy. He bought the prescribed drugs and left the hospital. When he got home, he served the food he had taken earlier from the eatery, and he tried making his wife eat because she hadn't eaten for more than 24 hours. He couldn't give her drugs without food. Sandra sat looking at the food in front of her and the drugs on the table, and tears rolled down her cheeks. Back at the hospital, where Naomi was being revived by the doctor, immediately after Sandra dropped the call with her husband, the doctor walked out of the room with a nurse. Sandra ran towards him with Deborah. She then asked how the little girl was doing. The doctor said that everything was okay with Naomi. She was just readjusting because of the surgery that took place. He assured her that all was well and they could go see Naomi because she was awake. Sandra held her chest and let out a deep breath. "Thank you, doctor," Sandra said, and rushed into the room with her friend Deborah. Naomi lay down on the bed, and tears rolled down from the corners of her eyes. Sandra knew Naomi was shedding tears because she was trying to understand what was going on, but she couldn't. Sandra told Deborah to stay with Naomi while she would go and find something for her to eat. A few minutes later, Sandra came with a plate of food. She made Naomi sit up and she started feeding her. Sandra found joy with every spoon of food she put into Naomi's mouth. Naomi was hungry, and she finished the whole food Sandra brought. Deborah could feel the love emitting from Sandra's eyes as she fed Naomi. The ladies were lost in excitement and didn't hear as Sandra's phone kept ringing inside her bag. It was Mr. Bright calling. He drove at a high speed, wanting to see things for himself. He drove for a long time, and his phone started ringing. He tried to pick the phone up from the passenger seat, and it fell down from his hand due to anxiety. He reduced his speed and then reached out for his phone. It was his wife calling. He picked up the call anxiously. His wife told him that Naomi was okay and out of danger. It was as if cold water was poured on Mr. Bright's head when he heard those words from his wife. It was already late, and he had left the city already. He really wanted to see Naomi with his own eyes and know how she was faring. When Mr. Bright arrived in his own city, he drove directly to the hospital. When he arrived at the hospital, something shocking happened. As soon as he turned off the ignition key, he felt as if something was behind the seat. He turned back, and it was Naomi's uniform lying on top of his back seat. Mr. Bright got out of his car and went towards the back seat to confirm it was really Naomi's school uniform. But how? He thought. Mr. Bright began to wonder if he was actually seeing right. It was so surprising to him. He left the uniform inside the car and entered the hospital. Sandra was alone with Naomi, who was sleeping soundly. Mr. Bright told his wife Sandra about the missing uniform of the little girl that suddenly appeared back inside his car. Sandra told Mr. Bright to come show her the uniform. When they both came outside and opened Mr. Bright's car, the school uniform was gone. They found out it was missing. The school uniform was nowhere to be found. "Where is the uniform?" Sandra asked in awe as she stared inside the empty car. "It was right there. I left it there. I saw it before coming to call you," Mr. Bright said to Sandra. "I'm not sure you know what you're talking about," Mr. Bright screamed, almost driven to madness by disbelief. "Honey, I am certain I left the school uniform right here at the back of the car. I saw it before locking the car and entering the hospital to see you. How could it have disappeared? No one else has my car key. Who could have placed and removed the school uniform?" Mr. Bright fell to the ground, gasping for air. Sandra was shocked, lost in thoughts, and stood motionless without saying a word. Is there someone else involved in Naomi's accident? Do you think there is more to Naomi's accident? Who could be manipulating the entire situation? Do you think there are deeper and more hidden factors surrounding the whole situation? Find out in the next episode. Stay tuned and enjoy the story. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with your loved ones if you enjoyed this episode. I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you, and God bless.